You've always been the one who cared. You replied when no one else would. You waited when no one deserved your patience. You forgave again and again because your heart couldn't hold grudges, only hope. You stayed even when it hurt, even when they walked all over you, because that's who you are, kind, loyal, soft-hearted. You believed in the good, even when it was buried deep beneath cruelty. But kindness without boundaries is a weapon, and the one it cuts the deepest is always you. And one day, you woke up completely drained, empty, unseen, used, not loved. You started asking, why do I always give more than I receive? Why do they only want me when they're broken? Why does love feel like sacrifice? No one told you this would happen. No one warned you that softness, in this world, is a dangerous thing to carry. That being the nice one often means being the first to bleed, the first to break, and the last to be remembered. But maybe this isn't the end of the story. Maybe this is where something colder begins. Not cruel, just clear. Not bitter, just wise. If your heart has ever broken under the weight of your own empathy, this isn't your weakness. This is your rebirth. They always tell you to be kind, as if kindness could shield you from the unseen blows life delivers. And for a while, you believe it. You choose patience when anger seems justified. You forgive when walking away would have been easier. You hold others through their storms, even as you quietly drown in your own. Because deep inside, something tells you it's the right thing to do. You become the one who never lets go first, who shows up even when your world is falling apart. Not because you owe anyone, but because you remember how it feels to be left, dismissed, forgotten. And you promise yourself, no one else should ever feel that way if you can prevent it. But no one prepares you for what that promise costs. Over time, something inside you starts to erode. You keep shrinking to make space for others, suppressing your own pain so theirs can be heard. You learn to wear a smile that hides exhaustion, to say it's fine even when it's far from it. And eventually you begin to disappear, present, but ghost-like, hollowed out by constant giving. It's not that the kind ones are weak, it's that they've carried too much, for too long. They believe that love means endurance, and that being good means saying yes, even when your soul whispers no. You tell yourself that if you just hold on, love harder, stay longer, someone will finally see you. But most don't. They get used to your silence. They rely on your selflessness. And when you finally pull back, they don't ask why. They accuse you of changing. To them, your tiredness is betrayal. Your boundaries feel like rejection. And suddenly, all the times you showed up mean less than the one time you didn't. That's when you realize you weren't being loved. You were being used, not out of cruelty, but comfort. They knew you'd always be there. They stopped wondering what it would cost to lose you. And when someone stops fearing your absence, they stop valuing your presence. So the kind ones break. Not loudly, not with anger, but quietly, in unread messages, in forced laughter, in the silent decision to stop explaining. They retreat, they grow quiet, and everyone starts asking, what happened? Never realizing the damage was done long before the silence. But something powerful happens in that breaking, because when kind people break, they don't come back the same. They begin to see what they ignored for too long. That love, without boundaries, leads to self-abandonment. That empathy, without protection, becomes a way of bleeding out. And so they change, not to become cold, but to survive. They learn to say no, to choose peace over people-pleasing, to love without losing themselves. When the kind ones finally break, it doesn't look like chaos. It looks like quiet. But beneath that quiet is something deeper, unraveling, a fall. And this fall, though terrifying, doesn't mean you failed. In fact, it might be the very thing that saves you. At first, it doesn't feel like anything dramatic, no crash, no tears on the floor. Just a steady numbness that settles in like fog. You begin missing your own voice in conversations. You smile out of habit, not joy. And slowly, your presence starts to fade, not to others, but to yourself. They say you only understand who you truly are once you've lost everything you thought made you, you. Your relationships, your reputation, your sense of purpose. But they never mention how quietly that loss arrives. It begins with small compromises you made to keep others comfortable, with boundaries you bent in the name of love, with nights you stayed up wondering why you always feel more alone around people than when you're by yourself. At first, you blame the exhaustion on stress. You tell yourself it's just a bad week, that you'll bounce back. But days stretch into weeks, and the tiredness grows heavier, like emotional gravity pulling you deeper into yourself. You stop reaching out, not because you don't care, but because you no longer have the energy to explain what even you barely understand. That's when it begins, the real fall. Not with a single event, but with the steady slipping away from the roles you used to play. The one who's always okay, the one who shows up no matter what, the one who absorbs every tension in the room and turns it into peace. And when you finally let go of that version of yourself, you expect relief. But what comes is fear. Because without those roles, who are you? Without their need for you, what do you even bring to the table? You've been the emotional caretaker, the fixer, the silent supporter for so long that when the silence is finally yours, it's deafening. There's no one clapping for your collapse, no safety net waiting below. It's just you finally alone with everything you've been avoiding, the loneliness, the shame, the hidden grief of giving your all to people who never truly saw you. But here's the secret most never realize. The fall is not the end. It's the beginning of something honest. Because when you break down, what falls away first is the performance, the version of you built to survive, to please, to earn love. And beneath that performance is someone real. Someone who didn't get a chance to speak because they were always busy holding everything together. Someone who didn't ask for much because they learned early on that asking makes people uncomfortable. Someone who learned to silence their needs, just to stay close to people who were never.
In the fall, that person finally surfaces. You begin to sit in the silence not to escape, but to listen. You hear the quiet ache that's lived in your chest for years. You begin to realize that being strong all the time was never strength. It was survival. That all the times you said yes weren't kindness. They were fear of being abandoned if you ever said no. And slowly, clarity begins to take shape. You stop chasing people who hurt you just because they once felt like home. You stop performing for love. You stop proving your worth to those who only see what you can give, not who you are. You begin rebuilding not with urgency, but with intention. And when people notice your shift, when they say you've changed, they're right. You have, but not out of bitterness. You've changed because you've outgrown being invisible. You no longer confuse being needed with being valued. You no longer carry the weight of everyone else's comfort while abandoning your own truth. That's what the fall does. It gives you the distance to see yourself clearly, often for the first time. It teaches you that solitude can be sacred, that space is where truth lives, that sometimes letting go isn't giving up, it's choosing yourself. And when that moment comes, when the fall stops feeling like failure and starts feeling like freedom, you realize you were never broken. You were becoming. And now, for the first time in a long time, you're not surviving. You're becoming someone new, someone you won't abandon.
But in that fall, something else is born. Something colder, quieter, more intentional. Because the world mistook your silence for weakness. But silence, when chosen, becomes strategy. And now, your coldness isn't cruelty, it's clarity. At some point after the fall, after the silence, after the ache of being forgotten by everyone you once prioritized, something inside you hardens. Not in a bitter, angry way, but in a way that feels necessary. Clean, controlled, cold. And the world sees it and recoils. They look at you, no longer apologizing, no longer explaining, no longer begging to be understood, and they call you cold. They say you've changed, that something's off, that you're not who you used to be. They're right. You are not. Because the old you, the soft, available, endlessly forgiving version, was sacrificed at the altar of survival. That version gave until there was nothing left. That version wore down their own spirit just to keep relationships intact. That version died the moment you realized that warmth without protection only attracts those who come to steal your fire. So now, you're cold. But cold isn't cruel. Cold is measured. Cold is patient. Cold is quiet enough to see things clearly, and strong enough to no longer react just to prove you care. Cold is choosing not to engage in battles where your only role is to lose. It's walking away without the need to announce your worth, because you finally understood that your silence is a better statement than any argument. Cold means you don't chase, you don't beg, you don't explain to people who already made up their minds. You conserve energy the old you used to waste, energy that now goes into protecting your peace, not performing for approval. And in this coldness, something powerful awakens. You stop reaching out just to maintain one-sided closeness. You stop overthinking every text, every tone, every shift in someone else's behavior. Because now, you've seen what happens when you ignore your instincts. Now, you trust them. You trust the feeling that says, "This doesn't feel right." You no longer justify disrespect just because it's familiar. You no longer call inconsistency love just because it comes from someone you miss. The coldness becomes a filter, one that keeps the noise out, one that makes it easier to see who's truly there. But what they'll never admit is how easy it was for them to leave when you cared too much, and how uncomfortable they feel now that you no longer do. Coldness makes people confront the parts of themselves they were able to ignore when you kept absorbing their damage. Now that you're no longer available to fix, to carry, to soothe, they're forced to face their own mess. And that makes them uncomfortable. But your life is no longer about making others comfortable. Your energy is no longer for public consumption. You've chosen discernment over desperation, observation over over-explaining, detachment over depletion. You're not heartless, you're healing. And healing often looks like distance to those who were only close to your wounds. Because once you've seen how easily people forget your softness, how quickly they leave when your yes turns into a maybe, you learn to hold that softness deeper, closer, and only offer it to those who can carry it with care. Now, your coldness is a form of self-respect. It's not a wall, it's a gate, and not everyone gets to come through. But something strange happens when you pull away, when your energy is no longer on the table, when your absence begins to speak louder than your presence ever did. They start to notice. They start to chase. Because nothing confuses the takers more than a giver who finally stops giving. There's a strange kind of silence that follows when you stop showing up. No dramatic exits, no final arguments, no long-winded explanations, just absence. A space where your energy used to be. And at first it feels like no one notices. The phone doesn't ring, the messages don't come. The people who said they loved you keep living as if you were never part of their world. That silence, it stings. But then something changes. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, like fog lifting. Suddenly, the people who once took you for granted begin to check in. Hey, just thought of you. Are you okay? You've been quiet. Quiet. What they really mean is, where did the version of you that needed us go? Because when you were always available, always explaining, always forgiving, always reaching across the emotional gap, they didn't have to try. They didn't have to show up fully. They didn't have to value your presence, because your presence was guaranteed. But now you've pulled back, and the takers, the ones who fed on your empathy like it was oxygen, begin to panic. They feel the shift, even if they don't understand it, because energy doesn't lie, and absence screams. You see, they never feared losing you. They feared losing the version of you who tolerated being lost. They were comfortable with the dynamic as long as you were the one overextending. Now that you're no longer bending, they're left staring at the space you used to fill and wondering why it suddenly feels so loud.
And here's the truth they'll never say out loud. They chase not because they love you. They chase because they lost control of the narrative. Your withdrawal removes their power, the subtle control they held when you were emotionally dependent on their validation. And when you no longer need it, when your self-worth no longer hinges on their approval, they feel it deeply. They say things like, "You've changed, you're cold, you used to care more." But you do care, just not in the way that costs you your peace. You've simply reallocated your energy. You've stopped auditioning for love in rooms where the applause was never for you. You've stopped being available to people who only miss you when your silence becomes inconvenient. And here's the irony. The moment you stop proving your worth, they start trying to earn it. Not because they've grown, but because they no longer know how to define themselves without your reflection. Pulling back forces them to see what they brought, or didn't bring, to the table. It exposes the imbalance. And for people who were never willing to match your depth, your distance feels like punishment. But it's not punishment, it's protection, it's preservation. You're no longer feeding dynamics where you're the only one emotionally investing. You're no longer keeping conversations alive just to avoid silence. You're letting people feel the consequences of what they neglected, and whether they learn from it or repeat it is not your responsibility. Because pulling back isn't about playing games. It's about reclaiming your emotional real estate. It's about no longer being accessible to people who only valued you when you were convenient. And if they come back, begging for the version of you they once drained, you'll know better. You'll know that the real shift didn't happen when they changed. It happened when you did. Because healing is not just about moving forward.
It's about refusing to return to what broke you. You're no longer here to be everything for everyone. You're here to become whole for yourself.
In the space where you once begged to be heard, you now choose silence. Not out of defeat, but out of clarity. You stop trying to explain, to prove, to justify. You stop waiting to be understood. And in that stillness, something begins to shift. Not as a performance, not for attention, but in quiet defiance of everything that once broke you. This is not revenge. This is rebirth. And it happens without announcement. There is a kind of transformation that doesn't seek applause. It arrives without warning, without noise, and without validation. It begins in the very places where you once shattered, in the cracks you tried so hard to hide. No one notices at first. There are no dramatic speeches, no declarations of change, just absence, stillness, a new way of being. You stop reacting. You stop chasing. You stop handing your heart to people who only knew how to bruise it. At first, this feels more like loss than power, because when you finally pull back from the people and places that once consumed you, what's left behind is silence. But that silence is not a void. It's space. And in that space, something unexpected grows. You begin waking without the weight of expectation. You stop asking, what do they want from me? And begin asking, what do I want from myself? That simple shift marks the beginning of your return, not to who you were, but to who you were always meant to be. And as you rise, quietly, steadily, the world doesn't know how to react. Some say you've changed, others say you've become cold. But the truth is, you've simply become clear. You no longer explain your boundaries, you enforce them. You no longer bleed to keep the peace, you choose peace that doesn't cost your sanity. This new version of you, the one with standards, with limits, with self-respect, makes people uncomfortable, because they never met this version before. You were too busy trying to be soft, agreeable, available. Now you're simply present, but not accessible. They don't understand this you, and they're not supposed to, because they were never meant to hold space for the version of you that honors herself first. And so they say you've become distant, that you're detached, but really you're just unavailable. Unavailable to manipulation, to guilt, to the unspoken expectation that you must always give more than you receive. They fear your silence, not because it's empty, but because it's powerful. When you were loud, when you were emotional, when you were easy to provoke, they could predict you. But now, you no longer respond to the same patterns. You no longer feed the cycle. Your absence disrupts the game they used to win, and that unsettles them. You're not cruel. You're just done performing. You no longer explain why you left. You no longer apologize for the space you need. You no longer sacrifice your peace to maintain a version of yourself that was slowly destroying you. And in that silence, you find something sacred. Peace. Not the kind that comes from approval, but the kind that rises when you finally listen to your own voice, when you let it guide you rather than drown it in noise. You realize that solitude isn't punishment, it's power. You begin to rebuild, not for them, not to prove anything, but because you deserve to be whole. And when people meet this new version of you, the one who doesn't ask for space but simply takes it, they don't know how to respond, because they expected the breakdown. But you gave them stillness. You've become a mirror, one that reflects not their fantasies but their failures. You remind them that your kindness was never weakness, it was grace. And now that you've reclaimed it for yourself, they're left with the absence they once ignored.
You're no longer hungry for their validation. You've become whole, not loud, not bitter, just untouchable. And in that untouchability, you are reborn. Not through rage, not through noise, but through the quiet, powerful act of choosing yourself, finally. And that kind of rebirth doesn't need to shout. It's felt, without saying a word. So if you felt that shift, if you've started pulling away, growing quietly, healing without permission, know this: you're not alone, and you're not wrong. You're becoming something powerful, something rooted, something untouchable. And now, it's time to carry that silence into action. You no longer need to raise your voice to be noticed, nor stretch yourself thin just to be accepted by people who were never really listening in the first place. And perhaps, what used to feel like loss has finally begun to feel like liberation, the kind that arrives quietly, but leaves nothing unchanged. You're no longer trapped inside a story where kindness meant self-sacrifice, or where your love was only valuable when it came at your own expense. Now, you've entered a different kind of chapter, one not built on proving your worth to others, but on protecting your peace from those who never deserved it. And while some may still try to pull you back into old patterns, into familiar roles where your silence was mistaken for weakness, you know now that withholding access is not cruelty, it's clarity. So this is what comes next. You stop running after the things that were built to break you. You stop feeling guilty for the space you've created between who you were and who you are becoming. You let your stillness speak where words once failed. You let your presence or your absence become the boundary. And while they may whisper about how much you've changed, you keep moving, slowly, deliberately, without explanation, not to prove anything, but because you no longer have anything to prove. If something in this message found you, if it echoed something you couldn't quite say out loud, then maybe this wasn't just a video. Maybe this is where your new story begins. If you're ready to walk that road, subscribe and tap the bell, not just to stay connected to this space, but to remind yourself each time you return that becoming untouchable starts with remembering your own worth every time.